Patrick. I'm Amy Sings in the Timber, the Executive Director of the Montana Innocence Project. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you so much for being up at the wee hours for some time with us. So we are excited to have Patrick Forbes here with us today. Patrick is the director of The Phantom, in addition to The Widowmaker and True Stories, WikiLeaks, Secrets and Lies. We are recording this so that we'll be able to share it with folks virtually. We've had some interest in virtual participation, but weren't able to do the screening in that way. I think folks will be really excited to hear what you have to say.
Great.
So without further ado, I just want to start by asking what inspired you to make this documentary?
Well, it was a completely chance event. I was making the movie about WikiLeaks, and we were going across America as part of the filming. And my producer said, "Hey, look at this amazing article about a guy who was executed who might have been innocent." And I went, yeah, Tilly, please, we've got enough trouble with our current movie. Let's not get sidetracked. She said, no, it's really, really important, this. And I said, anyway, she forced me to read the article. And I thought, it's extraordinary, because being accused of something that you did not do is of itself a sort of human and almost atavistic human fear. Being accused of something you did not do and then being executed is the stuff of drama, it's the stuff of films, it's the stuff of plays. So I thought, wow, I'm in. And that's how this all started.
This is a famous case.
Yes.
What did you do that was new?
Well, I mean, again, what we first of all did that was new was go across and persuade Jim Liebman, who is the professor at Columbia, whose research I was reading about. But having done all that, I thought when it came to actually making the film, Jim had talked to effectively one side of the story, which proved his contention. But I thought, if we're going to make a documentary, we've got to go so much further. We've got to talk to absolutely everybody. You know, people who believe that Carlos DeLuna, when he was executed, was innocent, but people who believe that he was guilty. Anyway, so we went down to Corpus and we talked to the cops, we talked to every lawyer, we talked to the families. And the reason being, this movie is about the truth, because Carlos got executed because people believed that it was true that he was guilty. And it's only when you analyze and put the truth under the spotlight that, oh, surprise, another truth emerges. And so, in essence, what I was doing was trying to disprove, a contention that everyone thought was universally held. And no sooner did I do that than, surprise, surprise, a different truth emerged. And that's the underlying message of this movie: is don't believe everything you read. Always debate it, argue it, think about it, because guess what? You might be wrong and a different reality might be at play.
Right. I recall the reporter saying something to that effect as well.
She's a fantastic woman, and she said, yes, 7 or 8 truths.
Right,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Yeah.
So you shot the film in Corpus Christi, and as you were just going through, you spoke with everybody that you could find connected to the case. Your interviews with Carlos Hernandez, former partners, were particularly powerful. Why did you shoot the film like this, and what effect do you feel like that had on the story?
Well, I mean, one of the things I don't know about you, but I get very bored with documentaries, particularly, which seem to take place in airless white rooms, and everybody's there for hours on end and they never move. And I thought, real life isn't like this. Real life takes place in lots of different places at different times of day or night. So I thought, well, what we'll do with this movie is we'll film it as it happened. Willful people where things happen, so they can say, oh, it was over there, the car went that way, or he came toward me here. And you talked about the interviews with Carlos Hernandez's partners and victims, and those were particularly moving. One particular instance was particularly moving because one of the women involved hadn't been back to the house where he had kidnapped her since that time, which was by that stage 20 years. And she was just sitting across from that very place, and you could see all the emotions rushing back into her. And so that reality, which was as raw as could be, would never have been the same if we'd just been discussing it, you know, in that airless room. And it's a tricky thing because you as a documentary maker don't want to exploit people, particularly people who've been through trauma. So I was careful with how we handled it, but it had one very unexpected side benefit in that I took the cop who first arrested Carlos DeLuna back to the site of his arrest. And as we were filming, a crowd of people started to come out, and which could be good or could be bad, but as it turned out, it was incredibly good, because one of the people amongst them tapped me on the shoulder and said, I was there that night. I saw both men run. And that was the first witness unearthed in 30 years who could prove that there were two people at the gas station that night, exactly as DeLuna had said, and exactly as the court had not believed. And the other thing that happened was another person said, oh, you got to talk to Bruno. I was going, what? Who's Bruno? And this guy said, no, Bruno's dad. And I suddenly began to realize they were talking about the police officer who had been in charge of the airwaves for the police that night. He was filtering all the witness statements and taking them back to base, reporting them back to base, and then base was putting them out on the airwaves for all the teams that were hunting the killer, in inverted commas. And he said, look, you've got to talk to Bruno because he's always believed there were two people there that night, that he was describing two people. And so anyway, so I talked to Bruno, and it's exactly as they say. He had always believed there were two people. And it goes back to that thing I just said. You know, the truth emerges in the most unexpected ways, but one thing you've got to do is keep re-examining it. And the cops, for whatever reason that night, just thought, hey, we got our guy, that's it. And anyway, by pure chance, we proved that they hadn't.
So Karen Beaudry, the journalist that we were just speaking about a moment ago, she forged this friendship with Carlos DeLuna, spoke about how this case changed her beliefs about the death penalty. Did making this documentary alter your perspectives about capital punishment?
Well, that's a tricky one because over here we don't have it, and I've always been fiercely opposed. I'm speaking to you from London. I've always been fiercely opposed to the notion that we should have it. But what it brought home, I think, making the movie, so it didn't change my perspective because I wasn't a big fan before we started. But what it brought home making the movie was I hadn't appreciated, first of all, the sort of sheer finality of a death sentence. And in that instance, if you have got to be totally certain, and for me, one of the most striking moments in the movie came when I was talking to the prosecuting attorney, and he says right at the very end, hey, is the system perfect? No, of course it's not. And the whole point about the death penalty is that it requires the system to be perfect, because if it's not perfect, you're going to make mistakes. You're going to get the wrong woman or man. And lo and behold, that's exactly what happened here. So I say, it didn't change my perspective, but it sure strengthened my conviction that you shouldn't have it. And it also, the other thing I hadn't understood was the sheer barbarism of some of the poisons used to kill people, which I don't think is widely held, and the fact that they can go wrong, as happened to Carlos. I could not believe what we heard when you hear that he died because in agony because the poisons were administered in the wrong order. And you just think it's not merely a question of killing people to prove that you shouldn't kill people, which seems of itself completely mad. But to do so in such a way seems something that no civilized society should do.
Right. Right. The moments spent with the father, recalling the steps, I knew that was something particularly staggering.
So moving. And he's such a dignified man. It's interesting. It's not, and he himself has slowly become a campaigner against the death penalty. It's quite interesting talking to him. He said he started out and he took the job because he was actually in favor of the death penalty in certain situations. It was only as he watched execution after execution, and two in particular, of which Carlos's is one, that he began to be worried about it and think perhaps this wasn't a great system. And anyway, we should, if you've got faith, which I'd say I don't always, but if you have, you should pray for him, because he's very ill, the father, right now, and I suspect getting toward the end of his days. He is a great man, the Reverend Pickett.
Thank you. Patrick, when Steve Schewitz, the ADA who prosecuted Carlos DeLuna, when he first makes an appearance in the documentary, he describes Corpus Christi as a very violent place, but that the thin veneer of civilization improved things, law and order and punishment. You powerfully overlaid this quote with historical imagery of violence between the Texan and Mexican armies, and you know, this particular district attorney carried this tough on crime perspective throughout the film. He never wavers, despite mounting evidence that he got it wrong. That everybody got it wrong.
Yeah.
Was it awkward to interview him? And, you know, was it difficult for you to maintain that objectivity?
I laugh when I saw that question, because it's funny. It's one of the odd things about if it is a profession, or my profession, is that you talk to people whose views you really don't hold, and you can still, despite yourself and them, like them. And intellectually, I share none of Steve's beliefs in this, though he himself is actually, interestingly, opposed to the death penalty now, having prosecuted, and is, he is himself not in person as his on-screen persona would suggest. Speaks 8 languages, incredibly well read, so a big deal Democrat and a campaigner against the death penalty now. So there you are. That's not what you would think of. So in terms of talking to him, that's not. In terms of dealing with his views, yeah, I think you're right. It was tough to talk to him over time, because for good or ill, publicly, he maintains that they got it right. And as you say, the evidence is they did not get it right. And also, but I felt that his final comment, the quote from Kant, the crooked timber of humanity, indicates a degree of private unease that he's subtly hinting at. And so even he perhaps must be beginning to worry that they got it wrong. Or, that would be my suspicion. As ever in any movie, you always want to go back for one last interview and say, hey, come on. Are you sure? Are you sure? But strangely, I don't have limitless millions. You'll all have to give them to me.
Well, I think too, it's so interesting to that go back for one last question, Patrick. It reminds me of Karen going back for that one last question. Carlos's brother going back for that one last question. Right now, now's the time. The now or never.
That's it. I mean, that again, isn't that extraordinary? Your brother is about to die, and you've always thought that he's guilty. That's what that question really means.
Sure.
And the reporter, have always thought that he's guilty, despite this sort of strange pen pal relationship that's grown up, where you've grown to understand each other a wee bit more. So yeah, and that was an incredibly moving moment to talk to them about and to understand, because it's a human thing. In this situation, you're always going to have a little doubt about, is he really innocent? Is that what he says? And that's what I think that moment says to me is, first of all, they're human. They've got that little doubt. And then to realize that he is innocent, because he's got nothing to gain by maintaining his innocence when he's just about to die. It must have been horrendous. And it's interesting. Every time I talk to Karen about that moment, she started to cry, because the rawness and of the emotion of the discovery that her preconceptions were wrong was so great. So
that is one of the things that we hear from our clients, is that lifelong friends, family even, as soon as you're behind bars, it's so easy to lose that faith and to dismiss the human life, the person that is there. A different story, a different narrative starts to take over.
I completely agree, because you look at somebody, in a prison uniform, and some bit of you is just going to think, hey, they did it, didn't they? I mean, it's terrible, and it shouldn't be, but that's, I'm sure, what they think, what the world thinks, and what they have to fight against.
Certainly. So I want to ask you, ineffective assistance of counsel and cross-racial witness misidentification are both contributing factors, it seems, in Carlos DeLuna's wrongful conviction. There were also extreme examples of official misconduct in claiming Carlos Hernandez never existed when he was known to the DA's office, and likely a police informant, in fact. Are you, as you were learning about this story, as it was unfolding, what was the most compelling cause of the wrongful conviction to you personally?
Well, I think the two things that you hit upon. I suspect, but I could not prove, because all the records have been destroyed. And anyway, they were kept in a most bizarre manner, befitting to, I guess, the way that records were kept in the 1970s and 80s. I suspect that actually Hernandez was not a regular police informant, but what they used to be in Corpus Christi was a sort of terrible bartering system between the then DA's office and some defense attorneys, whereby if you came forward with information, you could get a lesser charge or term. And so what I suspect happened, and I can't prove this, is that relationship lay behind the absolutely bizarre treatment of Hernandez, because you can see down the years that he's arrested again and again and again and again and again, and yet he serves either no term or a really short term. And it's, you just think, what? How the hell could this be happening? And as you say, there's the extraordinary thing that, despite the fact he's on a murder charge in the same courtroom with the same weapon 4 years previously, come this trial, nobody knows who he is, or apparently knows who he is. And I would suspect that, knowing the people involved, that Schwitz, who's only new to the town, who would have no reason to, obviously he's only been there for 4 or 5 months, would have no reason to know who Hernandez is, was himself kept in the dark as to his true identity. And there's a very telling exchange in the movie where there's effectively a debate about whether he was or was not told at the time. And I have to say, if I had to put money on it, I would say that he was in the right and his colleagues were not. But, I'm not going to know until I get a lie detector on all the people involved, because it's one person's word against another. So I would say that there's a sort of web of relationships that leaves Hernandez effectively if not unprosecutable, certainly to be treated with kid gloves. And then underlying all that level of official involvement is the fact that at that time, as the movie goes, Mexicans in people of Mexican heritage in Corpus Christi were treated appallingly and were treated disposably. And so there was a slight, who cares which one it is, attitude going on. Hey, you know, neither of them is great, so what? You know, well, at least we got one of them. And that was, as you say, that sort of racial profiling was, I think, incredibly important. And it's so universal. I mean, I've been in another documentary, which I filmed over here in London. I overheard two murder detectives saying, who cares? It's one black guy rubbing each other out with, you know, so what? And it was so surprising to go, you know, thousands of miles and find exactly the same attitude expressed, albeit rather more elegantly, by, you know, the lawyer of Hispanic heritage, Rene Rodriguez, who was, you know, tirelessly fighting for his people because there was such a problem. Anyway, so that's the long answer to your question.
I appreciate the long answer. I think that the nuances are important, and I also, you know, really your ultimate kind of overriding is then reiterated at the end of the film in the, you know, the closing print.
Well, it's extraordinary. Until, again, if you were talking about my discoveries, I hadn't appreciated till I went to Texas, till that bit of Texas, that Corpus had effectively been a battleground between Texan and Mexican, and now American and Mexican, for a century. That was the frontier, and that legacy of the sort of incredibly, which obviously I shorthanded with those pictures of black and white pictures from the various wars, but it was a place of extraordinary violence, and that violence has had a really enduring legacy, and that legacy is not great.
Right, intergenerational. Patrick, Professor Liebman and his team found the 45-minute recording of the police chase that proved they were pursuing two men that night, and that the other one was likely Carlos Hernandez. There's a very telling soundbite from the police tape that says, "Do we have a suspect in custody or what?" How does the result of the police chase demonstrate the intentions of the police that night and the negligence of those involved in finding the truth?
Well, again, so it goes back to that most human of things. You've got a woman who's been killed in the most appalling of ways. You charge to the murder scene and you start running all around the neighborhood, and you know, you're getting a lot of calls in, you're getting a lot of panic calls from the neighborhood. If you also look at the traffic, if you get the full recording and look at the transcript of it, you can see there are calls coming in all the time, people are spotting stuff. And you can see it's that most human of things. It's a panic, and it's a panic that gets worse as they don't find anybody. And so it goes back to the thing you and I talked about half an hour ago. It's like, it's a preconception. He's got to be out there. He's got to be out there. So it's not so much, have we got the suspect? You know, we know what we're looking for. It's like, have we got anybody who can stop this chase? We're all getting, you know, we're getting panicky. We can't find anything. We've got sightings here, there, and everywhere. And you know from your work with your clients just how powerful eyewitness evidence is in terms of making a preconception, but also how unreliable it is. So suddenly you're in the middle of a chase. You're desperate to find somebody, anybody, and there's a man under a truck, and he stinks of alcohol, and he hasn't got half his clothes on. So he's got to be the guy. And that I think is the power of that have we got a suspect thing. It's like, oh, he's out there, you know, oh, there he is. Wow, we got the guy. And what is then extraordinary, given, as you allude to at the time, is everybody thinks not merely have they got the guy, but they can't be almost bothered to prove it. So they wrap the murder scene within half an hour of the arrest, which is extraordinary. The forensic standards are appalling. There's blood everywhere. but no fingerprints are managed to be lifted because the forensics officer, who is dead, so I'm not, as it were, libeling the living, he does such a poor job that the fingerprints aren't recognized, they're smudged. And so there is any forensic evidence that you could hope to get from the scene is blown away, and which is also a part of what goes on with this miscarriage of justice. I think one of the most telling remarks that Jim Liebman makes in the movie is every mistake that could be made was made. And boy, oh boy, did they make a lot of them on that first night. And that goes back to that sort of atavistic rush to justice, when it would have been a lot better if everyone gone, hey, just let's take a breath. Let's find the right guy. Let's do our job at the scene better. And maybe even then this miscarriage could have been avoided.
Absolutely. Lastly, Patrick, your documentary is a commentary on racism in the criminal legal system.
Yeah.
And as Karen Boudreau put it, how we categorize people and so easily throw them away. Justice was denied to Carlos DeLuna and Wanda Lopez alike, in part because they were Mexicans. How did you approach this topic, and what do you hope people take away from the documentary about how race plays a role in criminal investigations and prosecutions?
Well, in my case, it was only, I actually didn't approach the topic. It only became slowly apparent to me that this was at play, because as I said, one of the things I decided I should do is talk to absolutely everybody involved. And so if you do that, I mean, one of the things that also as a documentary maker, I should quickly say is you should never approach any subject with a preconception, because if you do that, you're effectively making an advert, not a documentary, because you're not looking at the facts as they stand and or the people as they stand in their own right, which is really, really important. So with that sort of homily out of the way, what I began slowly to appreciate from largely talking to the Hispanic lawyers was the role that an endemic racism, as I said, stretching back 100 years, had played in this case, because nobody much cared about the victim because she was Hispanic. Nobody much cared about the guy who was being executed because he was Hispanic. And lo and behold, nobody's going to make much of an effort to find the real guy because he was Hispanic, but maybe they're Hispanic. And so all those various racial filters blinded them to the truth. And that's I think it's all too often very easy to cry race, but it is equally as an explaining factor without having had a look at the facts. But what this case shows is, sure, it's all too easy, but all too often it is the case that it's at play. And as you say, if you look at the statistics on who actually gets executed in Texas, it is overwhelming people of Afro-Caribbean or Hispanic descent, and to a ridiculous preponderance that indicates, guess what? Prejudice is leading the wrong people to get executed, which is, I think, the underlying message of this film. Don't give in to prejudice. Don't give in to discrimination, because if you do, the people will be, Carlos DeLuna will not be alone. There will be others who die when they should not.
Thank you so much, Patrick. We are incredibly appreciative, not only for this incredibly important film, but also for the time that you have spent with us here tonight. We will allow you to get some sleep, and just want to thank you once again so much for your time and for your art.
Hey, well, thank you very much. It's been a real pleasure, and you shouldn't be so nice to me about making me get up in the middle of the night. Hey, it's worth it. It's very important, this stuff. Anyway, I'm preaching to the converted, because your work is every bit, if not more important than mine. So thank you.
Thank you so much. Have a good morning.
Good night to you. Bye.
Bye now.